The reading for the seventh Sunday after Pentecost is from Deuteronomy, the 6th chapter, which can be found on page 143 in the Bibles in the pews. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. The gospel for this morning comes from the gospel according to Matthew, the 22nd chapter. A man asked, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." The gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, over the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking of different ways we pass on the faith to children. Okay? We put a cross in their bedroom, right? When they're little babies, we hang a cross in their bedroom. I borrowed this one from my son. I did ask permission, so that's a win. I'm getting better about that now that he's 15. I have to ask permission. Okay. We read to them from a Bible or a Bible storybook, right? Great thing to do. We show them Veggie Tales. We get the songs stuck in our head and we learn the Bible stories too. We bring them to church, right? To worship and Sunday school and vacation Bible school. We send them to camp. Woohoo! We had so much fun at Camp Oppo. And yes, that blonde kid, that is my daughter. She's 5'1" now. I'm sorry, she's growing up. It's kind of freaking me out. And as we continue our July sermon series, where we're looking at the verse after famous Bible verses that we are familiar with, today's famous verse is from Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. You heard it with the children at the children's message. I saw a lot of you learning it yourselves. Nice. Okay, goes like this. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Okay? You probably recognize it, right? And you might even think you know part of the verse that comes after it. But this one is tricky. This is like the trick question week because Jesus quotes Deuteronomy in the New Testament. And most of us know it from there, okay? So if you're thinking Jesus, you're probably thinking the verse after it is, this is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Great verse to know. Love it, fantastic. But we're in Deuteronomy. And the really cool thing about the Deuteronomy verse is that Jesus memorized it as a boy, which I think is really, really cool. So in fact, our whole reading from Deuteronomy today is called the Shema. And some say it's the closest thing that the Jewish people have to a creed. Okay? Jewish children learn it from the time they're little, and Jesus was Jewish, so he learned it as a child too, which is partly why he quotes it in our gospel reading. What's the greatest commandment? Well, it's the one every Jewish child learns as part of the Shema as they grow up. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And in the Shema, in Deuteronomy, the verse after the verse says, keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. I love that image, to keep God's words in our hearts. I think maybe there's a reason that when we have something memorized, we say we know it by heart, right? It's a part of us. A lot of us know that famous verse by heart, and the verse after says to keep those words in our heart. As we talk about this passage today, if you're a visual learner like me and you want to have it in front of you, pull out the Pew Bible. It's on page 143. page 143 in most of the Pew Bibles. The passage in Deuteronomy 6 goes on to tell us how to pass those words on to the next generation. Recite them to your children and talk about them when you're at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. We are going to talk about how to pass those words on, I promise, but first I want to back up and talk a little bit about the Shema and Jewish tradition, because I love this stuff, so I'm just going to nerd out for a little bit, okay? So if you look in the Pew Bible, the first verse of the Shema, verse 4 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." In Hebrew, the first word of that verse is Shema. Okay? That's where this passage gets its name, from that first word of the whole passage, Shema, which means to hear or listen. This verse is why the Shema is so central to Jewish faith. It talks about the Lord being the one and only God. And this was unique at the time. Deuteronomy was written when other cultures surrounding the Jewish people worshiped many gods. They had a god for this, that, and the other thing. And those gods could be fickle. But the Jewish belief in one God, one faithful God, set them apart. So this passage begins by telling God's people to hear these words, to listen to these words, the proclamation of who God is, and the instruction to love God. This passage, our whole first reading today, is so important to Jewish faith and life that they put it on the doorposts of their homes. Okay? Remember what the end of the Shema says? Write these words on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And here's how they do it, with a mezuzah, okay? The little box being hammered to the door frame there. My husband John and I actually bought one of those. We bought a mezuzah in Israel years ago, and we hung it in our house in Wisconsin. And that was a couple of moves ago. So we moved about 2 years ago again now, and it's in a box. Don't ask me which box. I can guess which area of boxes it's in, but I didn't go digging for it. So otherwise I would have visual aid for you, but this is what you get because it's in a box. But at any rate, a mezuzah is a small box with a tiny scroll of the Shema inside. Okay? And you hang it on the right side of your door as you enter your home. So every time you enter the house, you're supposed to touch the mezuzah as a reminder of God's presence and a reminder of God's words, to love God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our might. It's a beautiful tradition and a great way to pass on the importance of God's presence and God's words and loving God, which makes me want to go dig ours out. But anyway, let's get back to keeping these words in our hearts and how we pass them on to the next generation. Verse 7 says, "Recite them to your children and talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise." In other words, make God and God's word and loving God part of your daily conversation. Kids learn by watching, right? They see what we do, they hear what we say, they notice everything we do. That is why parents of toddlers, you notice them suddenly start to clean up their language, right? When the kids are able to repeat what mom and dad are saying. We've all been there, it's okay. All right? So as the children in our lives grow, we can make talking about God a regular part of life. Okay? Sometimes if you're driving somewhere and you got the kids in the car, you've got a captive audience, That's actually when my kids ask theological questions. I don't know, but it's an opportunity, right? So if you notice God's action in the world, mention it. If you're struck by the beauty of God's creation as you're out at the lake, say it. If something reminds you of a Bible verse, let them know. You don't have to know where in the Bible it is, but you can say, oh, there's a Bible verse, something about blah, blah, blah. That's enough. If they share a worry with you at that quiet time before bed, let them know how you think about God in the midst of that worry. Ask them how they think about God in that worry, and then pray together. You don't have to beat them up with the Bible. That would not be good, okay? But take advantage of the teachable moments life sends your way with the children in your life, in your neighborhood. One of the things we talk about a lot at our house is today's gospel, where Jesus quotes Deuteronomy. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. This is what we struggle with at our house. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, okay? Kids struggle with this. Now, you might wonder, why isn't love God enough? Shouldn't that take care of loving your neighbor? Well, in a perfect world, it would. In a perfect world, when we love God, we realize that all people are created by God, so we love our neighbor as part of God's creation, just like us. In a perfect world, we remember that Jesus died and rose again, not just for us, but for all people, including our neighbor. God loved them that much. So in a perfect world, yes, loving God is enough because it spills over. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you are well aware, we do not live in this perfect world. My kids don't live in a perfect world, which is why we talk about this so much at our house. Jesus was born into our broken world. And he noticed that religious people were remembering to love God, but some seemed to forget all God's commands to care for the orphan and the widow, to welcome the alien and stranger in their land. So he wrapped all those instructions into love your neighbor as yourself. Now, to be fair, he's quoting Leviticus 19 when he says this, okay? But my point is that people needed the reminder in the first century, and we need the reminder today. Love God and love your neighbor. When we do those two things, everything else falls into place. Life is better for everyone when we love God and love our neighbor. Society is better. People are cared for. People are heard and feel like they matter. Keep these words in your heart. Okay? Let them be part of who you are. Let them be part of every conversation you have with children and adults. Imagine what that would look like if we remembered to love God and love neighbor in every conversation. Imagine how the dynamic of talking about politics would change. Okay? There's a way to work for justice, to speak for what you think is right that reflects love of God and love of neighbor. Okay? Let's keep these words in our hearts. Let's talk about them and talk to our children about them. Children notice everything, and we all want the world to be a better place. So let's live out these words with every post we put on Facebook, every interaction we have, and with every word we say. Amen.